Rapid pace of progress within the life science enterprise requires an equally rapid pace of development of science policy that allows for bioeconomies to grow. For GapSummit 2017, we have assembled a panel of experts to discuss the challenges that exist to shaping regulations and policy while keeping all the stakeholders engaged. With a booming biotechnology and pharma sector, federal governments certainly have their work cut out for them in keeping patients safe without stifling development. Our panel discussion today is titled Science Policy and Regulation, Balancing Risks and Rewards of Scientific Advances. Our moderator will be Dr. Robert Graboyes, Senior Research Fellow of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Thank you.
Well, welcome. Thank you for having me. I was at this equivalent conference 2 years ago, and I'm just always stunned to be in a room full of people like all of you. So in this session, we'll look at the policy angle. I tend to focus mostly on the U.S. policy angle, but not entirely, and we'll see what we can bring up. We are in an unprecedented period of technological development in not only pharmaceuticals, but I think in all aspects of healthcare, from remote sensing to additive manufacturing to nanotechnology. It's a very exciting time to be alive and to be working in this. We have an excellent panel. I'll just say very quickly, I'm Bob Graboyes. I'm at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. We try to be a nexus between policy and specialized fields such as yourself. The other panelists, I'll let them do quick introductions. And if I can address the panelists, there are a lot of us up here. So I think I was saying last night that I'm hoping what we can do is to manage this, structure this something like a basketball game. I would rather not be bowling where each of us goes around sequentially and does long monologues, nor do I wish it to be a rugby match where we're all grabbing the floor, or for American viewers, something like The View on TV, where you can't hear anything. So I'd rather it be something more on the lines of a basketball match where you speak for a bit, you don't hold the ball too much because you'll snatch it away, and if you want, you can pass it over there, and keep it lively, and we'll incorporate. It's kind of up to you whether we save questions for the end, or I guess that's probably the best idea. Although if someone has some absolutely pressing question, we'll consider that possibility. But with that, let's get started. I guess I'll just throw out a first question. So, at least in the United States, there's a lot of talk about innovation, a lot from the government, a lot from the private sector. Let's start with what are we doing right and what are we doing wrong? And start with any of you who would like to do that. I'll add one sentence. I like to describe my own research as being, how do we make healthcare as innovative in the next 25 years as IT was in the last 25? And so one way to frame the question is to say, what do we need to do in healthcare?
Well, I can kick things off.
Start it off. And do an introduction, too.
Oh, yeah, okay. My name is Gary Andres, and I am Senior Executive Vice President for Public Affairs now at Bio. I've only been there for a short period of time, just about, as I said, my boss just addressed you, so I told him I hope I don't embarrass him or anything like that. But so I can't, with the lights on, I can't tell if you guys are laughing or frowning or angry or whatever. But anyway, so it's hard to kind of gauge the audience. But prior to that, though, I spent a little over the last 6 years up on Capitol Hill with Kristen and some others. I was the staff director for the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And one of the big projects I worked on over the last 3 years was the 21st Century Cures legislation, which President Obama signed in December of last year. And just to your question about what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, it reminded me that when we began formulating the 21st Century Cures bill, which was now a little bit over 3 years ago, it was about over 3 years kind of in the making, and we did a number of roundtables where we brought in various stakeholders and listened to them and things like that. because we, the Congress is not a scientific body by and large, and so we really wanted to hear from the community about what they thought needed to be changed, modified, and the like. And one thing, to your point about what are we doing right, that we heard a lot from people, and it was kind of almost like a common denominator through the whole process, was that the medical research, healthcare enterprise in general, as it relates to research, has got to foster more collaboration, become different pieces of the system. And we tried to do some things in that legislation to foster more collaboration. I think there's still, there's always more that you can do, but I think that is one thing that we're kind of at least trying to do right. There's, obviously the goal and where reality is, but I think that that's something that, we're trying to do more of, and I think I see more and more of that happening in the medical and scientific world in terms of trying to come up with new drugs and devices and things like that. So I think that is one thing that we're doing right.
Great. Someone else? Anyone have anything we're doing wrong?
I think I can jump in there. I'm Natali Morris. I'm with AstraZeneca in our Federal Government Affairs and Policy team. I think one thing, thinking about comparing IT and the developments there with the medical world, is that we're in a world now where there's constant feedback, constant opportunity for input, and also receiving information back, on a, just at all times. There's really at no point where you can't just look something up and find some information. And I think, now our healthcare system is still pretty siloed, still pretty old-fashioned in the sense that, a patient might receive a drug or receive a treatment and not necessarily know that much about it or be able to offer that kind of constant feedback. And so I know we're working at ways to incorporate technology more into our medicine. So smart inhalers, they tell you right away you're using the inhaler wrong, or they help you keep compliant with your medication regimen so you don't stop using it and no one notices for weeks or months or maybe never. So I think trying to incorporate that more sort of consumer-oriented, ratings and feedback and education that happens all the time through your apps more into your daily healthcare routine.
I would also jump in there and say, and by the way, I'm Scott McGoohan. I'm Director of U.S. Regulatory Policy and Intelligence for Vertex Pharmaceuticals. And Gary and I were ships passing in the night at Bio. I also used to work there as their Director of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs. And one thing that I'll identify is, I think, a challenge that we face consistently as we talk about the regulated environment, and also, I think, an opportunity for us to continue great work that is done in the regulatory agencies, is adapting to new innovation. Laws and regulations are promulgated at a fixed point in time and may not always provide the requisite clarity or foresight for what may be coming down the road with the next generation of insights, innovations, and technologies. And so some of the challenges that a regulator may face, and that then therefore the industry faces, is how will a regulator view a new technology? Looking at new modalities such as the new generation of genome editing technologies, CRISPR-Cas9, CPF1, those types of technologies. How are those going to be viewed? How are they going to be classified? What regulatory requirements are going to be applicable? How do you structure those trials? I know Dr. Litwack within CDRH has worked extensively on NGS, next generation sequencing, which kind of challenges how we had approached single analyte diagnostics in the past with these incredibly powerful panels that can look at a whole host of different markers all at once. So I think that that's going to be a challenge that we will always face as laws are fixed in time, typically try to provide some flexibility for unimagined scenarios, and an area for, I think, great collaboration between the industry, between the regulators, and the scientific community as a whole.
And so, Litwack, obviously, I've been introduced now, but so I'm on the personalized medicine staff in the Office of In Vitro Diagnostics. And I would agree with a lot of what Scott said, and I would say one thing I feel like we're doing a lot better on both sides is that collaborative work. I think, I think there used to be a real, bright line between industry and FDA, and other stakeholders and FDA, and I think there's a lot more discussion, and I think that benefits everyone, So I think that's good. I would say, not that I don't want to judge what's good and what's bad, because I do tend to think about things in terms of trade-offs, but I would say one of my big concerns is just, we've focused a lot in the last few years on getting access to data, and that's incredibly important. And I feel like we spend less time worrying about, there's increasing talk about, but still it's problematic, data quality, data reproducibility, and then data analysis. So we're going to get a ton of data. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to make sure we don't repeat some of the mistakes that we've of the past in terms of biomarker discovery, and really a vast literature of discoveries that couldn't be verified or reproduced, and that's it's something we have to think about throughout the entire pipeline, and it's just, data access, collecting more data in and of itself is just one part of the whole picture.
Sure.
I'm Hugh Freeze, and I'd like to speak about this from the standpoint of a bench scientist. So I'm president of an organization called Federation of American Societies of Experimental Biology. It's called FASEB, and you see why. So we represent over 125,000 biomedical researchers and engineers, and I want to echo what you said about the 21st Century Cures Act. That was a major advance, and so has been the now consistent 2-year, $2 billion increase in the NIH budget. Before that, it had decreased from 2003 by 22% in terms of real spendable dollars. And that was an enormous kick. It soured a lot of people on going into biomedical research. And as you know, and we've heard already, this is, that's the innovation driver to start with. If you don't have the pipeline of the basic scientists coming up with new types of information that can be validated and then used by various companies, you're going to be in trouble. And so one thing that I'd like to suggest, that there may be an opportunity for additional interactions, and I agree that we have to have a lot more collaboration, maybe an opportunity for places like bio to partner with basic scientists, not just on their individual research, which is critically important. You have to have that. But also in walking forward to Congress and going together and saying, these guys and ladies are the pipeline, and we depend on them for finding the new discoveries, for developing the new drugs. And I think that there's a lot of room for development in that, and I'd like to see that happen.
Mm-hmm. I can jump in and add that. So I'm Kristen Shatynski. I'm congressional staff on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Prior to that, like some of you, I was a grad student, I was a PhD student at University of Maryland. And after I defended, I decided that I didn't want to do the traditional research route, and went to Capitol Hill instead. So it shows you can do anything with a science degree. But what I wanted to add was that 21st Century Cures really it streamlined our innovation process. It really gave a shot in the arm to the NIH and the FDA. It also, it required the establishment of a way to support young, innovative scientists, basically so that way they have, the access to the grant funding and the support. That also, it's not just the funding, I think it's also the way in which folks are funded. At least, what I remember when I was a grad student, and what I continue to hear is that you have, 10% of the PIs getting about 40% of NIH dollars, and that makes it really hard for a young investigator to get up and running, get a lab running, and the idea is, it's almost like stocks. You want to diversify, right? And have, that's where the innovation comes in. It's usually kind of serendipitous. So that's something that 21st Century Cures did. Congress essentially told the NIH to start, looking at ways to really support emerging researchers. And the NIH had been, they had noticed that was a problem, and they're working on that now. So I think, regarding workforce, that's something that's been an issue, and I think that we're taking steps in the right direction to fix it.
There's a couple of themes have come in here regarding regulation. Let me throw out a conjecture. So regulation, as we know it, really dates back, I don't know, in this country to the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is, I think, the 1880s. So it's actually a fairly brief history, and I think the environment's changing quite a bit. When the FDA was created, and certainly through most of the 20th century, what they were doing was information, sort of a modest amount of information that was hard to obtain, expensive to process, and even hard to disseminate. We were dealing with scarce information. Today, what we have is unbelievable masses of new data, new information. It's much easier for a decentralized world to get a hold of the data, to process it, to disseminate it. And my conjecture is that the current regulatory system was in part designed for a world where innovations tended to be heavy, expensive, relatively immovable, easily traceable financially, leaving a big paper trail, whereas now earth-shattering ones can be transmitted by an app on a cell phone. And the question is the current regulatory framework actually still appropriate? Can it manage the massive data flow and the speed of innovation that we're seeing?
I would say that I think a point that Dr. Litwack made in his opening remarks is ringing true to me as I hear you saying that, and that we shouldn't be judging it by the volume of data. I think what makes it more difficult is sifting through to understand what of the data is important. I think there's a greater emphasis on analysis, as anyone here who's been in doctoral programs and done scientific research will understand. There are many ways one can set parameters and gatings and cut data in a way that they see feasible. So it's about understanding what your plausible rationale is and what the underlying justification is for how one is analyzing data and presenting it. I think that if anything, it becomes more challenging the more data that you have. I think it's a problem that regulators deal with, it's a problem that industry deals with, and I'm sure it's a problem that is faced in basic research as well.
And I think I would just add on, so my experience from within the agency is certainly, regulations, may or may not fit. I mean, obviously it was a system, for devices, which is where I live, that was developed 40 years ago. So, we couldn't really conceive of the world that we would be regulating now. And so, I think it's always worth asking what's appropriate, and I don't really have a judgment one way or another, but I will say in my experience, what has really made a difference is, what to me was surprising about FDA was the degree of flexibility in the way we can use the regulations to accommodate. Now, sometimes it's really obscure, it may not make sense, but I think, we've certainly, worked very hard to, and a lot of us come from scientific backgrounds, so we, I think, have the same attitude towards this technology that anybody else does. We work to see that these things get out, that they're safe and effective, but we also, our goal is not just safety, it's access, that's a part of this. So I think, and in the precision medicine initiative where we've really looked to think about how we're regulating genomic technologies given the challenges of big data, and it's a very new thing. I think we've found ways in which, when fully implemented, we can really take what we have already and make it work with that. So, there's always room for change and improvement, but I also think, my plea is not to discount the flexibility that the regulatory agency like the FDA can have, and to engage in the conversation. I know it's with them. I know it can be a very frustrating process on both sides, but I think often I'm very proud of the outcome that we get. And I think oftentimes the sponsors who bring their new products in are also, maybe they're just saying it to me, but, they seem to be happy with the experience they've had, in many cases. So.
I would echo that. I would say from our experience within Vertex, we have seen an incredible amount of flexibility, particularly in areas that are difficult to study where typical clinical trial paradigm may not be appropriate, or as you look at rare types of mutational variants of a rare disease, where it's simply infeasible to conduct study. There was recently an approval for an expansion of a product of ours called Kaleido, which was partly expanded on the basis of in vitro data, where in vivo data was simply not possible. So I agree that the FDA does provide an incredible amount of latitude and flexibility where scientifically supported. So.
And I think this is especially important in rare diseases where sometimes you may only have a patient population of 50 or sometimes 10. So you're not going to be able to run the same kind of trials. And I've just been really impressed with how the FDA has managed to say, well, let's see if we can find pathways that'll get something out to patients. Because if it's your kid, it's the most important disease in the world. It doesn't matter that it's rare. It's important.
Absolutely.
And I think in the user fee agreement that's being, going through Congress right now, there's some really good developments in terms of use of real-world evidence and patient-reported outcomes to be considered more. So I think those are positive developments too.
One of the things that we also heard in the development of the 21st Century Cures bill, and I hope we accomplish some of this not only in the legislation but just in the way that the committee that I used to work for approached the FDA, was that we did hear oftentimes that, from people at FDA and other places, that some of the flexibility that you're talking about maybe wasn't exercised to the full extent it could have been or should have been, because the only kind of, from a cultural standpoint, the only time the FDA heard from Congress was when they did something bad. And they were so there was a cautiousness on that, in that regard. And we tried to change that a little bit. I know I was in several meetings and tried to send the message that when we tried to also, from the congressional standpoint, let the FDA know when we thought they were doing something good too, not only so that they would hear from us when they did something good, not only when they did something bad. And from our perspective, I hope that helped a little bit from the cultural standpoint. The other thing is that I do think that where Congress can kind of play a role in some of this, and we heard this as well during the development of the bill. So I think I agree. The FDA has a number of flexibilities, but I think sometimes having Congress more or less, validate it or say something about something that they would like the FDA to do helps the senior management at FDA with that process. And the thing I think of specifically was in the last Paducah, Congress created a breakthrough designation, and then in the Cures bill, we had a similar type of pathway for devices. And I think what we heard from senior people at the FDA is that in many ways they may have had the flexibility to do that on their own, but it was helpful to them to have that kind of imprimatur from Congress that this is something we want you to do. So I think that was something we tried to work on as well.
Zero in on this very specifically. And I'll admit, being something of an outsider in this, I don't do big data. It's been a long time since I have anyway. I've heard critiques of not just the FDA, but other regulatory agencies that the statistical methodologies, traditional hypothesis testing, gold standard, may have worked very well mid-20th century and on, but perhaps there needs to be a move more toward Bayesian methods and other. Are we really up to speed on the statistical methods, or is that somewhere where we need some innovation?
I know that was something identified in the stakeholder conversations during 21st Century Cures development, and basically incentivizing those kind of more innovative methods was included in the legislation. So it's, something that's addressed, and I think it's ongoing.
And that's also something that the industry brought to the table in the Paducah negotiations. And just to bear, how many folks in the audience are actually familiar with what Paducah is? Okay, so for folks who may not be familiar, and please supplement with any additional knowledge as necessary, Paducah is every 5 years, the industry and the agency come together to negotiate an agreement whereby the industry pays fees in the form of before and currently application fees, product fees, and establishment fees. Those fees are to form the basis of other resources for the agency to help fund the review program and other associated programs for the applications that the agency is receiving. There's PDUFA, which is specific to prescription drugs. There is MDUFA for medical device. There's GDUFA for generics. And there's now BSUFA for biosimilars. So this has proven to be an incredibly successful program that was initiated in '92 in response to the incredibly long wait time for review of an application that ranged between, I want to say it was between 26 and 36 months in the 80s, and now has dropped considerably to, I believe the average review time is below 8 months, although if someone has a better figure, I would welcome that. So it's been an incredibly successful program that has provided the agency with the resources and funding they need to do the job, the very important job that they carry out. And so every 5 years, this package is renegotiated and submitted to Congress, who then has to pass it in a legislative vehicle or a law. And that is an opportunity for other policy proposals to be inserted into that overall package. And as Gary mentioned, the breakthrough program, which Vertex had the first breakthrough drug, the aforementioned Kalydeco. So again, this is what happens every 5 years. This is kind of like the Super Bowl in science policy, I would say. And so we are in the midst of a reauthorization cycle. So just wanted to help ground people.
Let me switch to maritime law. About 250 years ago in the coffee houses of London, there was a realization that safety and efficiency regulation of shipping was a necessity in a world that was increasingly dependent upon global shipping. There was also a realization that no one government could actually do a sufficient job, because if you weren't happy with the regulations in Britain, you could change the flag on your ship and declare yourself of another nationality. So they moved to a system where essentially there was a constellation of classification societies that did voluntary certification. And I wonder, I have thought about this a lot, are we moving toward that kind of a world where it is very difficult for one nation, even the United States with all of its market power in it, to actually oversee pharmaceuticals, devices, in a world where international travel is very inexpensive? Some of the most important devices and drugs can be carried in small containers, and even to the point of sort of app-driven devices, if we define an app as a device, or a world where you can go to an open source molecule somewhere on the web and get a 3D printer and print out your own pharmaceuticals. Can national regulation actually survive the 21st century, or do we likely move more to some sort of an international regime?
That's a tough one.
Oh, wow.
Any?
The U.S. is not trying to be very international at this point.
Well, and so I would say that, yeah.
What do you do with that?
Yeah. Well, and data is international. And I think that's a big, when you get into legal matters of jurisdiction and just, scientific matters like harmonization or harmonization of regulations, or even harmonization of science, there are huge challenges. And there are certainly, FDA participates in various work groups with EMA and other agencies to try to get things aligned and try to get common risk patterns. But it's a challenge because different countries also, there are different values and different expectations. So I think there's always this challenge of how you align something that represents in many ways different values or different cultures. So I think it's going to be a constant challenge. I'll take things that we, have to grapple with is, anybody running a genomic test is going to be getting data from all over the world, from databases, from various sources, and so some of those sources are in the U.S. under our jurisdiction, and some aren't. So, how do we deal with that, right? And I think similarly, I've heard a lot from pharma companies that, it's the harmonization is a real challenge in terms of clinical trials and making sure, testing is the same and you're getting the right populations and everything. So, I mean, I don't know the answer to it, but, that's certainly, I would certainly agree this is a huge challenge, and the speed of communication just makes it harder.
I mean, it's fairly simple for the FDA to say you can't use this particular MRI machine in America because no one's going to sneak a 6-ton device in, very likely. When it comes, for instance, there was famously the FDA put the kibosh on 23andMe for a while, which it worked. On the other hand, if I wanted to use 23andMe, it was available in Britain, and I could have fairly easily gotten a hold of it and sent it if I really wanted to. I imagine that an awful lot of what will be important in this century looks a lot more like 23andMe than it does look like an MRI machine. But any others on internationalization of, in particular, of regulatory arbitrage, for instance?
This is way out of my wheelhouse, but I mean, I would expect, the free trade agreements, establishing good free trade agreements would be a good place to start. Mm-hmm. As I said, I don't know if we're currently in the best place for that either, but,
I would point to what Dr. Litwack had said before about moves towards harmonization amongst international regulatory requirements. There have been a number of groups, including ICH and APEC, who have brought together national regulatory authorities, health ministers, and those involved in the regulation of science and medical products, and try to bring them together to align on what are reasonable expectations. And we've seen recently ICH has expanded to include other states. 15 states were added as observers last year with the intent of bringing them into the fold going forward. These include some more developing bioeconomies, Brazil being one of them that has now been formally included. And we're seeing a standardization or at least more standardization in what are commonly accepted regulatory requirements in clinical practices that is helping to provide more confidence. Because if you're conducting a large-scale clinical trial for a given product, it would help streamline and reduce costs to ensure that that trial will be acceptable for registration purposes in every country in which you're going to file. So this, I think, is a critical movement forward. There's always going to be some variation just based upon what a society feels are its relative parameters for risk, what it's willing to accept in terms of uncertainty, and just overall its priorities within its economy and society.
I think, too, what the payers are willing to pay for will make a big difference, too.
Yes.
So as, technologies might become available and you know more about what's going on in other countries and you start to demand, well, they have it, why can't we? Why aren't we getting paid for it? Or maybe it's something that will really reduce costs downstream, some kind of new device I can't even think of that might help you predict something as an individual, then I think that'll make a big difference, too.
So some of you early on discussed the notion of collaboration, the importance of collaboration between different producers, between producers and the government, between different layers of government, and here we're talking about between different governments in different countries. So let's address that a bit more about what does collaboration look like, and just to put look at some of the positives, but also some of the negatives. There's arguably a fine line between collaboration and collusion. Regulatory capture, it is easy. We certainly can look historically in the history of regulation, starting with that first great regulator in the U.S., the ICC, whereby it sort of degenerated into a cozy relationship between producers and regulators at the expense of the public. So what do we need to do in this, and what are the things we need to worry about along the way?
One of the things that that I was kind of disappointed in the 21st Century Cures legislation was that we weren't able to go further on some of the data sharing provisions that we talked about. And you know, in the political context where the conflicts that we had were the on one hand the interest of scientists and researchers in having access to data, and on the other hand, people's concern about the privacy of that data, if it were, you know, if it could be identified, traced back to individual people and stuff like that. And so that's kind of, those are kind of the two, I guess you could have two ends of the spectrum, that, you know, you can't share anything because there's a possible risk of people, you know, having their data or information shared in places they don't want to, you know, there should be kind of, you know, full and robust, you know, sharing of everything. And so we tried to kind of find a balance there between those two. I think that the people who raised a lot of, well, what if this happened, what if that happened, tended to beat us in that. But I do think that given all the data that is being produced and the interest that we had in fostering more, you know, collaboration and things like that, I think that there was probably more we could have done, and I hope that there's more that, you know, Congress does down the road to allow researchers more access to all the data that's being produced, so that they can use it for scientific and research purposes.
And I think at least some of that is the education of the public, so that you know, if an attorney comes out and says, well, these are the possibilities, and you want to protect yourself against that. And I understand those arguments, but I guess on the other hand, somebody, scientists themselves don't do a very good job of it, unfortunately, but somebody needs to make the point, well, here are the kinds of benefits. But if there's not an understanding of the research enterprise and how science really works, if you don't get that, you know, in here, then it's harder to buy those arguments, and you'll get the knee-jerk response of protectionism over the greater good and perhaps even your own good.
I think broader than just the U.S., we're seeing this discussion about data sharing, who owns data and to what degree it should be shared, play out around the world. Within the EMA, you have Policy 70, which will be transitioning into the clinical trials regulation, whereby clinical trial results are being required to be posted at certain milestones following the completion of a clinical trial. And that's something where I think we'll be watching that from the United States, where things get difficult, as Dr. Udders had mentioned, was in both for clinical trial participants, understanding whether or not this publication of data could subject them to re-identification. This has been long been a very pressing concern raised by the public and by other members. Balancing that with the objective need for more collaborative science and full access to information. And then also recognizing that for clinical trials that are being undertaken for proprietary drug programs to bring the next generation of innovative cures to patients, there is a need to protect some of that intellectual property for a time to allow a company to actually bring that product to market and be able to start to recoup its investment. Much in the same way as for a scientist who's in a laboratory, they may wish to continue to further their own research and get suitable publications out of it before all of their data sets are made public. So it's about understanding that there are a multitude of different concerns that need to be balanced against one another, and that may actually differ from society to society.
So, move on to this. So, a good deal of American legislation, American regulation revolves around protecting the public from dangers. And Obviously, it can be too lax in that. You can go too far in it to the point that the system becomes sclerotic. So there's a phenomenon which has been called Eroom's law. So we all know Moore's law, that over the last 50 years, the amount of data that you can fit onto a chip has doubled roughly every year and a half, 2 years, depending on which segment of time. And if you take the name Moore and do it backwards, Eroom, there's a sort of a reverse phenomenon that the number of innovations, the number of patents that come out of pharmaceutical industry per $1 billion invested has been going in exactly the opposite direction, that it's costing more and more and more. There's a slowing of how much bang you get for your buck in this. I tend to throw out as conjecture that part of the reason for this is we have very likely moved risk aversion in a number of theaters too far. The FDA is mentioned in this, and that's a possibility. HIPAA, certainly, privacy concerns. The capacity to share data is greatly crimped for the purpose of protecting privacy in ways that I'm not sure we actually have the privacy any longer. And institutional review boards, which greatly slow it. And I'll finish this with a little anecdote. I come from a very small town in Southern Virginia, and in the early 60s, and actually through most of the 20th century there, my family's doctor was an obscure doctor in an obscure small hospital, and was recognized around 2000 for having performed the world's first cord blood transplants on cancer patients. Just on an epiphany that he had in the shower, got permission from the patients, got some interesting results, got nowhere because he was an obscure figure. But almost certainly what he did would be impossible to do today because of consumer protections, patient protections. So the question is, are we going too far in protecting, and is this having a sizable impact on how hard it is to get the magical things that this crowd produces out to the public?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have too much red tape, regulatory red tape, or if you go too far in the consumer protections, you're really you're stifling innovation. I mean, obviously we want products and new treatments to be safe and effective, but if it's at the cost of innovation, there has to be a good balance.
Well, and I would say, it's important to think about history and why things are the way they are. I mean, if I weren't a scientist, I would probably be a historian, and I like in my spare time to go figure out why why things like in the regulations are there. And I think for every one of the cases I think it's always going to be a balance. For the cases you talk about, who knows how many patients were hurt, and you often only hear the success stories and not the failures. And I think this is an area where certainly more data will help people achieve the right balance. But I think it is one of those things that often, as you were sort of alluding to, either things exist for a reason, like something was put into regulation for a reason. We may forget why that reason was, and it may or may not be appropriate now. But I mean, it would be, I think we do have to stop sometimes and think about why something is there. And, I think, and certainly in terms of medical device regulations, major changes in regulations usually happen when there's a public health disaster, and this is always the challenge. We want to get the right balance without having to have the disaster to drive that, and that's just sort of not human or political nature, but that's where it is. So, but I think, I think understanding why things are there, what the events were that led up to regulations or laws or whatever is a valuable exercise.
I agree. Anyone else on this?
You know, I work on a series of rare diseases, and so what you see is a lot of the parents, oftentimes of these patients, will form support groups, and they'll talk among each other. And some of them get rather sophisticated. There are groups like Patients Like Me, who will be their own advocates, and they will educate themselves to a pretty high degree about what's available, what the science is like, and they will become experts. If they go in and see their doctor may be embarrassed because they're telling him or her things that they've never heard of. So they send them back to the literature. So, you know, that kind of thing is important. So I think we're going to see, especially with data sharing, the internet, and all the social networks, you're going to see a lot more of these sorts of things coming along. And so patients will begin, you know, certainly not in the big major diseases, I think, but certainly in the smaller ones, that may start a movement that we'll have to contend with on yet another level and see what that looks like, because I'm sure they'll tend to push for the opportunity, the right to try opportunities, which may or may not work. And as long as people are aware of the risk, and I think this goes back to the same thing, what are your privacy concerns? So getting that balance, but at least if the public is informed about that and they've taken that into consideration, go for it.
One of the, I showed some people last night, I love to flash this around. This is a little device that does, I experienced AFib about a year ago, and this is a small device that costs $99 that will do an electrocardiogram and will analyze the wave patterns and tell me whether I need to go talk to someone in a hurry. I spoke to a group of 250 insurance executives and asked how many of you are familiar with the device. It is an FDA-approved device. And I don't think a single person in the room had heard of it, which I said, well, you know, every time one of your clients runs to the emergency room unnecessarily, you've written a check for a few thousand, and every time one of them fails to run to the ER when they need to, you may be paying a couple $100,000 after they have their stroke. And I also, I teach at a couple of medical centers, I speak to medical groups, and I will flash this thing to cardiologists who either have never heard of it or scratch their head and say, well, I heard there was such a thing, but I've never seen one. And it's my metaphor for, or is the information on technological innovation diffusing rapidly enough? I mean, my answer is no. But is this a problem for more than just this device? And if it's a problem, what do we do?
I think Eric Topol's book, The Patient Will See You Now, is a real excellent example. And basically, if you don't know who this is, he's a physician who heads up the Scripps Translational Medicine Initiative in San Diego. And he's a cardiologist. And so he goes on to talk about the availability of data and the movement of patients to do exactly what you've done, and gives examples of many other devices. And he said we could save so much money. I think he was even on Stephen Colbert at one point doing some diagnostic. But the point is, physicians should not be the last ones to know about this, right? I mean, they should be part of the mix. So I think you're absolutely right. This is not getting out there quick enough, and we need to do a better job. But they may force us to do a better job.
I think so. I'll put in a shameless plug. I heard about this from Eric's book, and next week he and I have a paper coming out from Mercatus on the history of medical paternalism. So,
Great.
So he's a very exciting person to work with.
Yeah.
What else? Any similar anecdote stories of information not getting out either to the medical community or to the public at large, things we could be doing and we're not because we haven't heard about it?
Sure. So one of the reasons I was excited to speak to this group is I think it's immensely important that we do get scientific voices inserted into the policy discussions, because absent this type of knowledge getting in there, the regulations, the laws, the statutes that get written can only be so good. And frankly, when we are devising regulatory frameworks governing medical products, we need to ensure that they are science-based, that they are informed, and that they adequately balance the risks and benefits of any measures that are being considered. I think that, as Hudson and I have talked about, scientists are really good at talking to scientists. That's something we excel at. I think oftentimes in our excitement and zeal and passion, the critical missing link is we're not as good at talking to the public. And as a result, the pace of science will far outpace where the public is either aware of, what the public is aware of, where they're comfortable going, or even what they see the long-term visions. You've certainly seen this in the last, let's call it 2 years, related to advances in genome editing, where you've seen a massive pushback, much in the same we saw for cloning decades ago, where the public has entrenched and has, I think, gotten very wary of how this technology could be misapplied, as opposed to understanding what the true possible benefits of it could be. And as Hudson has talked about before, Alan Alda is a key figure who's trying to work with scientists about how we communicate to the public. But I think it is incumbent on us that our success will in many ways be limited by our inability, or at least how we have yet to learn to communicate freely, openly, and in accessible language, these complex yet exciting topics to the public. I think that will be something that will be critical as we have the next great breakthroughs and continue to advance the scientific fields.
I would agree with that. There definitely needs to be a need for better communication between the scientific community and policymakers. I think the American people and folks in Congress are interested in science. I mean, 21st century cures wouldn't have become law if they weren't, but there's definitely like a communication block between the scientific community and those making policy.
And I'll just build on that a little bit, and I can use this as a shameless opportunity to put in one small advocacy plug. But I think there's another area of communication that's important, and that's communication between the people who are like in the case, drug manufacturers and payers, in terms of there are regulations in place that restrict that to some extent, and I think that they were just about to go through that, I think, in the debate on the Paducah bill that they just worked on. And I do think one of the reasons why that is important going forward is that I think that the current payment model that has evolved over time doesn't really accommodate, I think, what a lot of the new therapies going forward are going to do in terms of you might have a drug approved that you just take it once and you're cured, and that in terms of the way that the payment system is set up today, it doesn't really accommodate that to some extent. And I think being able to have better communication between the drug manufacturers and the payers about kind of what's coming down the pike, what it might cost, how you could structure would be a good welcome reform as well. But there are people who oppose that as well.
And I think just building off of that, sort of the overarching problem of an over-focus on the short-term costs versus the long-term benefits, I think, is one of the reasons why there's a lot of controversy and debate over the price of drugs in particular, but also devices. I think people might question, how does this benefit me right now, and not thinking about the long-term, cost offsets of some of these really cool devices and drugs. So I think, to your point, some of the regulations that get in the way of that, and also just, the way our system is structured, where somebody who's paying for the 50-year-old taking the drug, maybe the benefit accrues to Medicare, and so that payer isn't going to really care, So there's a lot of kind of silos that I think get in the way as well.
I'd like to go back to that point about communicating with the public. When I came into FASEB as the president, it's interesting, this GapSummit. I said, mind the gap. Harness the energy. Fill the gap. So what did that mean? Mind the gap was the gap between us as scientists and the public, and the way we speak, the way we use technical terms, the way we just snow everybody because we're so smart. Well, it's not very smart, because they are the ones that support us. They're the voters, they're the taxpayers. We owe them, they're paying for us. One way or another, they're doing it. We owe them back, and we owe them a conversation, not a one-way, I will stand on my podium and tell you the way it is. We have to be able to talk, and that's what the Alan Alda program really does so well. It sort of teaches you how to do this. And the harness the energy that I talked about was look at the march for science all around the world. Wow. We can't let that momentum die. You know, we got to grab it, and we'll fill the gap then. The problem is my generation, I'm over 70, so my generation is not well equipped and doesn't think about very often communicating with the public. We're not kind of set up that way. But you all, you're the future. And I mean that so sincerely. This is going to be your charge going forward, because you're going to be able to make the difference, and you're going to be able to now communicate with everybody. And to me, that's one of the most important things going on out there. There's a course called The Art of Science Communication that the American Society of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology does. And we teach people how to communicate, much like the Alda situation, but it goes over several weeks. But having courses like that, having those opportunities, and having you be committed to that as part of your education and part of your duty as scientists going out there in the world. I'll get off my soapbox. Thank you.
Soapbox is good. Let me just ask one thing. I see 15 minutes. I think we've actually got 30. Is that correct? So we're really 30 minutes. Okay. So when that gets there, you can leave that. That's fine. We'll break for questions and answers when that gets fairly close to zero. I just want to make sure. So the funding issues are interesting. How do we fund these? And my mind can go all over on what is the optimal. I think of the Medicare funding, the Medicare reimbursement formula as it has its virtues. It also is arguably the single biggest problem in the system, in that it may well skew the course of innovation, that it may be reinforcing, putting into place yesterday's drugs, yesterday's devices at the expense of newer, leaner, meaner, better things. And so the question, so let's address that. What do we need to do as far as the funding of, well, we can cover the whole gamut, from basic research to applied research to the actual consumer usage of the products. I have my views on how we might improve it, but I'd love to hear yours.
Well, I think starting with the first piece of that is the basic research. We do not have a biomedical innovation engine without basic research. It is, if you go back to Vannevar Bush back in the 1940s and 50s, who headed up at that time what was the Scientific and Technology Office that helped underwrite the Manhattan Project and that really recognized the vital role of basic science research. He outlined 5 principles that form the foundation for the National Science Foundation and really our national and world-leading biomedical research engine at the NIH. And one of them was the consistency of funding, predictability of funding, long-term funding to allow people to meaningfully plan out their research and have confidence that year to year that they have that money committed to it. As we have seen, thankfully with 21st Century Cures, a hike in the funding at the NIH, we have still seen a stagnation before then that I think really imperils, if we're viewing this as an engine, the basic research is the fuel that has to go into the engine. So it's absolutely critical that we double down and reaffirm our commitment as a nation, and I would argue internationally, to basic research. You know, it was recognized at that time, even back in the middle of the 20th century, that private industry what it does best is taking basic discovery, applying it, and generating the next generation of innovative medical products, technologies, what have you. But the basic science is really something that is fundamentally, I think, a federal responsibility, or at least partially a federal responsibility, and something that we would be short-sighted to lose track of.
I would build on that. I think that, and it still goes back to the communication aspect. You know, throughout the cures process, I mean, a lot of those most of those changes wouldn't have happened without stakeholder input and without discussions with the scientific community. And I think it's got to go beyond March for Science. I think there needs to be more active participation in the legislative process from scientists, grad students, the whole community. I mean, for example, as a congressional staffer, I can tell you every single year you have the Disease Alzheimer's Association, you have the MS Society, you have the insurance industry, you have like the drug companies that come in and they talk to their members of Congress and they talk to the committees about their priorities and what, and offer their assistance and how they can be helpful and what legislation is going through. I haven't been on the Hill that long, but my entire time thus far on the Hill, I've spoken to maybe 1 or 2 scientists. They're
Really?
That may change now.
Yeah.
We got to talk.
March for Science, no one requested a meeting with any committee staff or with the chairman or anyone, and I think that's a huge problem. I mean, policymakers aren't going to, you're not going to get favorable policies if nobody knows, what you're asking for, nobody knows what the problems are.
Sure, absolutely, let's go ahead. And we can sort of go back and forth. Oh, okay. We have someone down here.
Well, this is Aftab Ahmed from National Academy of Young Scientists in Pakistan. It's a very nice discussion about science policy, although a bit boring for us. But the things is, we know there is a lot of research work in the United States, but the things are like, if we say the translational research, especially if we talk about biotechnology, like I can take the example of stem cell research, is more translated in developing countries, like if we take the example of India, China, Thailand, Philippines, and there is like, they are doing the stem cell therapy, but here it's a lot of it's more regulated here, so things are not going in that. And the regulation is not that strong in those developing countries. And as Dr. Robert already mentioned, that how we have to do this international scenario, what we have to do in this situation where the things are much more regulated here and that they are not much regulated there in developing countries. And the other issue is when we have to, the clinicians, they talk about the therapies and they are doing the trials and they are doing the therapy there. The other clinicians, they always say there is a red flag because FDA hasn't approved these therapies. So in this, there is a lot of confusion. And the other, one more point is on some of the issues about the science policy, like the GMOs, Europe is not in favor of that, and America is in favor. And the developing countries are either looking at Europe and towards the US, but they are going to decide about it. So I think there should be more discussion about these issues so the things will be more clear.
Okay. Anyone have any comments? Okay.
Well, with GMOs, 85% of scientists said don't much worry about, but there's only about 40% of the American public that agrees with that. So back to communication again, we haven't done it well. And if we believe in it, we got to go do it.
I think to the point earlier about stem cell therapies, that's something that has been heatedly debated in the halls of the United States Congress over the last year. And you're bringing up a very good point, which is that there are stringent regulatory authorities, of which the US FDA is certainly one. And I think most people in the United States would acknowledge that the US FDA is probably the most stringent regulatory authority in terms of how it is maintained by the safest drug supply in the world. When you're talking about emerging technologies, such as stem cell therapies, where for every paper that you read in a daily newspaper in Tennessee about a patient whose macular degeneration was reversed or someone who's experienced some other benefit, there are also a number of publications that will talk about people who develop tumors as a result. So I think that understanding that there are, to Dr. Litvack's point, there are reasons why there are safeguards in place that protect the participants in clinical research and may in fact not speed things to market. It's about understanding why those rules and regulations and barriers are in place, and understanding that there is a rational basis for it. I agree that in some cases we may see a very conservative approach as we are still understanding how a technology can be utilized in the medical landscape, how it can be utilized to help individual patients with distinct needs. But I wouldn't say that this should be, therefore, because other countries may do things more rapidly, that therefore that means that U.S. regulation is somehow flawed. You know, we need to have these international conversations about how we achieve the proper balance. And the balance isn't simply between safety of clinical trial participants and the need to get new things to the market. It's about a holistic assessment of how are we funding these things? What incentives are there? How are they going to be paid for once they actually reach the market? Each one of these are critical junctures, and there's many more, intellectual property being one of them. You know, how do we make sure that each one of these is finely tuned such that this biomedical innovation ecosystem operates at its maximum without jeopardizing the safety of the public?
And I just want to build on something Scott said, which is that I think we have to be careful about driving policy with anecdote. I think it's a natural thing to do. I think, obviously, anecdote is the easiest way to communicate. I mean, analogy, anecdote, I mean, this is how you get people to explain things, understand things. But at the same time, it often can be very misleading. And I think as scientists, you all know how anecdote can be biased and, lead you astray. So I think that's where, that is one of the big communication challenges, is because it's, if you have a highly technical point on one side and the other side is anecdote and an easy message, I mean, that's a pretty unfair fight to begin with. So.
If I could please remind everyone to keep their questions a little bit more concise, because we want to get to as many people as possible.
Basketball.
Thanks. Hi, Chaz Heinzman, a PhD student here at Georgetown. I just wanted to get maybe some of your perspectives with the recent change at the head of the FDA, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, and how maybe you each look at that kind of change and how it affects you moving forward from industry, from the bench, from the FDA, and from the Hill.
Do you want to start that one?
Okay. Well, I would say I don't know how well he's been there about 3 weeks. Transitions take a long time, in any transition takes a while. So I think it's clear there are some priorities, some very important things, opioids being one of them. So it's unclear how much other issues will or will not get attention, and I think it's just going to take time to develop. So we just don't know enough at this point. He seems like a nice guy, I'll tell you that. So,
Yeah, it's kind of early in the process. Opioids, dealing with the opioid epidemic is important. On my end, Dr. Collins still at the NIH, so not much is changing there.
Yeah, I think also increasing generic competition is another one of his priorities. We carefully track those policies, obviously, and are supportive of that.
Yeah, it's early in the game. I'll say this: he's bright, he's experienced, he's sort of an interesting combination of an insider and an outsider. So,
and I would also argue, as a cancer survivor himself, he brings a patient dimension that has sometimes been overlooked, or people have felt has been overlooked within there. So I think, it is very early. He also is not just the commissioner of drugs and devices. He has an incredibly broad portfolio. So, I think we in industry remain optimistic that there will be some, solid science-based reform that will lead to, a more finely tuned agency to the needs of patients.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Kevin Chandrov. I'm a resident physician at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Thank you for a very stimulating discussion. I think that we often think about the importance of having engagement from the public and, as we've discussed, communication from scientists with the public. But I think that something we don't often necessarily connect with that is the educational policy that goes along with that, and the fact that we really need an educated public to communicate with. And I think that as scientists, when we're focused on funding and communicating with politicians and all of that, we don't always really fight for the educational policy that probably we need to have a public that really supports that. So what can we as scientists really do to help create an educated public in terms of having an educational policy that really supports that, so that the next generation will really support science and really want to support the things that we're fighting for?
I don't mind starting if you don't mind, the moderator doing it. I tend to think that the public is quite willing to be educated in things where it matters that they're educated. And they will not be educated if doing so doesn't bring any virtues. So for instance, I'm paid to be a healthcare policy expert and to know a lot about insurance. If you ask me, is my health insurance policy better or worse than any other in America, I don't have the faintest idea. Why? Because I don't have any need to. My employer gives me this policy. I don't have any need to do comparative shopping because it isn't going to do me any good. I like to say that it's one of the few products in America, the few products that I buy, that there's no point in my leaning over the fence and asking my neighbor, what kind of insurance do you have, and what's good and what's bad about it. And so I think part of it is, for me, one of the problems with the healthcare system is that we have sort of divorced the public through third-party payer and other institutional devices. They have no particular need to know a lot of the information because it's not going to do them any good if they do. So the question is, how do you actually build in incentives that make it matter to the public to actually become educated? They know a lot about computers, they know a lot about cell phones, and those are just as complex as medicine.
Yeah, I think you're right. The public does need to appreciate better about science, but they don't need to necessarily know the periodic table and F equals MA and all this sort of thing. That's too much detail, and it's not really relevant. Francis Collins, head of the NIH, once said on a conference call, your best story beats your best data. Now, you got to have the data, but pathos is more important than p-value. So I think it's our job not to go out and only lobby for better funding for science. I mean, certainly that's part of it. We go to the Hill and we do that all the time. But we have to somehow let the public know that we're not separate from them. And I think that's what's developed here. The election, I think, gives you a great illustration of that, where there were the, quote, elites and there was everybody else. And it's our job to go out and figure out a way to talk about science and the excitement that's there in science. And this is how it works. It's not one and done. We build on this, we build on, we were going a little off. All right, now we're course correcting, we're going back this way. So it's our job to be able to explain to the public kind of what the process is like. And the discovery, because it's in everybody's heart. Everybody would love to make a discovery. But they don't know how to go about it. And they don't know yet how to separate fact, established fact, data, from those things that will be foisted on them as sometimes snake oil. So some of it is up to us to go out there and do that. And again, I think that's part of our job.
And I would also say that there is, as we've historically seen, a tendency in the public, and someone once observed this and they coined it someone's law, and I can never remember their name, so I apologize to whoever came up with this idea first. But it is that the public has a tendency to overestimate the short-term impact of innovation and underestimate the long-term impact. And this is something that we see play out repeatedly when you see the lay media reporting on scientific breakthroughs and innovations. Well, they will declare that something has cured a disease or something has solved a medical condition, when that does not actually reflect where the science is. So I think it's also, as we're communicating, to make sure that we're clearly and accessibly laying out and setting expectation, that people don't think that tomorrow they're going to be able to go to their doctor and get a CRISPR based therapy that will help turn their hair blonde, or something of that nature. I think clear, honest, accessible communication, I think, is critical.
And examples of that together with, I was a kid, and the guy I was working with, I was 20 years old, said, let's go to Yellowstone and play around in hot springs. Let's see if we can find bacteria. Well, we found bacteria. I got this thing called Thermus aquaticus. What's it good for? Oh. Well, I don't know. We thought we'd put it in laundry detergent, right? Because it could work at high temperatures, and maybe that would make cleaner clothes, but the organism's yellow, and so that's not going to work. So it had absolutely no use. It was a little bit of a curiosity. Then Kerry Mullis came along, and he said, oh, I know what to do with this. And it completely revolutionized genetics. So you have to, again, spread broadly those things that are just curiosity-driven, but then also be ready for these things. And I think if the public understands that balance, that's the thing that we need to get across to them.
Yeah, I'll just add, humility is good too, and I apply this to my own. I consider it a science. We can vote on whether economics is or isn't, but recognition that there's a lot of wisdom, but there's also a lot of things we don't know. Vannevar Bush was one of the most remarkable men of the century, and I often cite the Manhattan Project as, if you want an example of where governments can innovate and do it well, that's it. On the other hand, in, I think, 1948, he went on a tirade saying that anyone who thought that we could build a missile that we could guide and bring down to Earth at a specific spot was a century off, whatever, that it was a pipe dream. And of course, the intercontinental ballistic missile was, I don't know, 3 years beyond that. So humility is always a good angle, and I think it works with the public too, if you bring that to it. Let's see, who else? We've had this hand has
Patient
been
gentleman
up
in the
for a
first row.
long time.
Thank you. Olivier Nijhuis from the Global Operations Graduate Program from AstraZeneca. Thank you for your interesting discussion. So we've been talking the last couple of days and now again here about the silos. Silos within companies, pre-commercial, post-commercial, but also within the companies in FDA or the science and the policymakers. But we're now talking with the people who are in the organizations that set the rules to the game of the industry. So what could the FDA or the bio or the Capitol Hill actually do to break down those silos?
That's a good question.
I think you're seeing in the scientific community, and the FDA has played a part in these, you're seeing some, and I'll approach this from one angle in particular, and others can perhaps explore others, but we're seeing greater collaboration in clinical trials. That's a great starting point, I think, where you're looking at different studies that are powered to analyze and assess how different investigational agents may work in different diseases, or how an array of different therapeutic options could operate in the same disease, and particularly as it relates to genetically stratified diseases such as cancers. We're seeing a lot more collaboration there. I think in terms of industry and how basic scientific research, we're seeing more and more exploration of data sharing that I think is helping to broaden and share and democratize a lot of the scientific data that's coming out, subject to some of the concerns and considerations that I did outline before. So we are seeing that type of cross-pollination. There are a number of initiatives that the FDA is involved in with multiple different organizations, both in the government and out of the government, to help to I think try to generate and crowdsource some of this general thinking as they are developing new regulatory paradigms. So we are seeing that. I think one area where you're going to see a great amount of resistance going forward, and I say this as someone who worked within bio and now works within regulated industry, is the pharmaceutical industry is developing at great cost a lot of really rich data that they are using to inform their medical products. My organization, my company, Vertex Pharmaceuticals, has invested more than $9 billion over 28 years and now has 2 products on the market. So there are definite costs to the development of this type of data. And while there are other groups, including patient organizations, as we alluded to before, the involvement of patients in becoming their best advocates, they are also gathering a lot of disease-specific information and patient registries that is helping to, I think, take some of the cost, take some of the uncertainty out of pharmaceutical development and biologic development, by providing ideas about outcomes. What are you going to be proceeding? What is going to be a meaningful result for a patient? How is the best way to study it? Can you provide a historical control to eliminate the need for a placebo group and allow you to develop a more efficient clinical trial? There's a lot of different instances of work that's already ongoing and that we believe within industry, I would broadly say, that will help to propel a more efficient and innovative drug development paradigm in the future.
And I would just say, I think the thing that really drives uptake of this sort of thing is success. Mm-hmm. So, once people see, oh, this worked, or, they start to adopt those. And I think there are a number of efforts now that have driven better data sharing. And I mean, we have a long way to go. There's also pressure to data share. In many cases, but I think the pre-competitive sphere, defining that, figuring out where the value is. I mean, one of my favorite stories is from a resource we've worked a lot with in our office, the NIH database called ClinVar that houses genetic information that's deposited for all over, and a lot of that information comes from diagnostic labs that were very resistant to data sharing, and I think at some point they realized, this data is much more valuable to us if it's in a pool, right? So at some point we're going to hit a limit. An organization sits on data and they sort of mine it, and then it's not going to be enough for anything else, and then they'll have to move forward. So I think, it seems like for, and I don't have as much experience in this sphere, but for pharma, the real value is in the drug. A lot of the stuff, that comes before that is just, is something that could fall within this pre-competitive space.
One of the things that kind of surprised me a little bit, I guess, as we were talking to various stakeholders during the 21st Century Cures process, and to your point about breaking down barriers and stuff like that, I sometimes think that people underestimate how much knowledge there is really among policymakers about what the obstacles really are, and sometimes they just don't know. And I think having various stakeholders think more about how they can bring those things forward and point them out in real life examples is important. I'll give you a couple illustrations of what I'm talking about. So we would hear a lot of people just speak generally about, well, we need to have faster, cheaper clinical trials, or we need to have more data sharing, or we need to do whatever. But and we would say, well, there's a lot of people who agree with you about that, but how? What specifically, what are the obstacles and how do you do it? And while that may seem kind of, obvious or common sense, you'd be surprised at how often people don't really understand what the real world obstacles are and what the real barriers are and what needs to be broken down. So I think that needs to be just articulated better.
Guessing we have one more question.
Oh, hi. Sorry. Quick question. My name is Paula Hernandez, PhD candidate in computational biology from K Graduate Institute and current part of the board of directors of a nonprofit called Science Clubs International, which aims to expand access to high quality science education in different countries, partnering with Ivy League schools all over the world. Here, I would say that I completely disagree about not having certain mastery, and knowing the p-value is very important because that's how people know how to reproduce later on certain data. Knowing the periodic table is really important for people to understand how, components are based, different types of things. And I truly believe that also knowing where the capitals of the different countries and where we are all coming from, it's important for the general public to know. And this kind of contradictory because at the end, yesterday, one of the speakers was saying that in order to be in the industry, you need to have a certain level of mastery, which goes back to science and technology. And you need to have a mastery of something to come up with ideas to bring that to the table for discussion. So here, instead of saying educating people, going back to a point of my fellow over here, it's like, it's like this triple helix thing about government, academia, and industry. What about the fourth element, which is nonprofits? nobody has really talked about beyond advocacy, but nonprofits, those are part of the responsibility for the society to ask questions as well. And I would like to know what's your take on that. You know, how is the work with nonprofit organizations beyond March for Science, for example?
I think if we have a quick answer, anyone?
I think we have actually touched on a number of nonprofit entities, and perhaps not all of them, and I certainly can tell you for certain not all of them. There have been a lot of different entities who have been working in endemic areas on neglected tropical diseases. There are groups who are patient advocacy groups who are nonprofit entities. There are those who are more focused on the personalized medicine coalitions, the bios, the pharmas that are industry specific. Those are critical players. I think oftentimes you're right that the people do talk about these conversations as between the agency and the industry, but the agency is also out getting the voice of the community as well and seeking and soliciting the perspectives of those outside of those developing the specific products. I can tell you that within regulated industry, we are consistently engaged with the nonprofit community in our, for instance, my group is invested in cystic fibrosis. So we work with, I would argue, every major stakeholder in cystic fibrosis and individual patients who want to talk to us as well. There are in the area of vaccines and as I mentioned before, neglected tropical diseases and other things that affect primarily areas outside of the United States. There are powerful voices. Groups like Doctors Without Borders, groups like the TB Alliance, who do have very important perspectives that are heard, and they are major participants in many of these policy discussions. So I would not treat any of our failure to mention any of those as a signification that they are not important players. They certainly are, and so I think your point is well taken.
Many of the advocacy groups that Congress meets with they're in the nonprofit space.
I was just going to say we had time limits, and that's part of the problem here. With that, I want to say thanks to the panel and thanks to the audience and thanks to GapSummit.